My name is Kendra, and I am 34 years old. We were standing at the heavily guarded visitor entrance of the White House when my husband grabbed my arm tightly and leaned in close to my ear. He told me not to embarrass him. He said I was just a mid-level government clerk and that I needed to step back and let his brother-in-law handle the talking. I did not answer him. I simply handed the Secret Service agent my personal security credential, watched the color completely drain from the agent's face, and waited patiently as a four-star admiral rushed over to salute me. But to understand how my husband's arrogance led to his absolute destruction on national television, you have to see exactly what happened in the moments before that security scanner flashed green. The evening air in Washington was crisp, and the line for the presidential reception buzzed with senators, defense contractors, and high society elites. Bradley, my husband of 8 years, was sweating through his custom Italian suit. He kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, desperate to look like he belonged among the power players of the nation. Standing right in front of us was the reason Bradley felt so important. Desmond, his sister's husband. Desmond was a brilliant self-made African-American tech billionaire who had built his company Apex Tech into a dominating force in Silicon Valley. Bradley rode his brother-in-law's coattails, relentlessly holding a hollow vice president title at Apex Tech that paid him an exorbitant salary for doing virtually nothing. Desmond was currently speaking loudly enough for the surrounding politicians to hear bragging about the $500 million cybersecurity contract his company was slated to sign with the Pentagon the very next morning. His voice boomed over the polite chatter of the crowd, making bold promises about revolutionizing military data storage and securing national assets. His wife, Monica, stood beside him, dripping in diamonds and adjusting her designer fur wrap. Monica turned her gaze toward me, her eyes sweeping up and down my simple navy blue evening gown with undisguised contempt. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped closer to me. She asked if I had bought my dress at a discount outlet. She said my outfit was completely inappropriate for a red carpet event and suggested that once we got inside the reception, I should probably go stand in the corner near the coat check so people would not associate me with their VIP table. She patted my shoulder condescendingly, adding that it was sweet of Bradley to let me tag along considering my salary could barely cover the cost of the parking valet. I kept my face perfectly neutral, offering her a polite, tight smile. For 8 years, I had endured this exact brand of humiliation from my husband's family. They viewed me as a financial burden, a pathetic public servant leeching off taxpayer money. Bradley had convinced them and himself that my job at the Department of Defense was nothing more than basic technical support. He loved to tell his wealthy friends that I reset passwords and fixed frozen computer screens for government bureaucrats. Whenever I tried to explain the actual scope of my work, Bradley would interrupt me, changing the subject to boast about his latest luxury car purchase or Desmond's soaring stock prices. He needed me to be insignificant so he could feel powerful. Bradley yanked my arm again, his grip bruising my skin through the fabric of my sleeve. He told me to stop staring at Monica and show some respect. He hissed that Desmond was about to secure the most lucrative defense contract in the history of Apex Tech, and my awkward low-income presence was already a liability. He warned me to keep my mouth shut when we reached the metal detectors, reminding me that my cheap government ID would probably just confuse the security detail. I looked at the man I had married. His face was twisted with anxiety and fragile ego. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. I had spent months quietly reviewing Apex Tech's network architecture for my department, and the things I had found disgusted me even more than my husband's dismissive behavior. But I could not reveal my hand just yet. I had to wait for the perfect moment to let them destroy themselves. We finally reached the front of the security line. A stern Secret Service agent stood behind a bulletproof podium flanked by heavily armed military personnel. Desmond stepped up with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He flashed a brilliant smile, slapped his gold-trimmed VIP invitation onto the scanner, and loudly announced that he was the CEO of Apex Tech here as a special guest of the Armed Services Committee. The scanner beeped. It was not a pleasant chime. It was a harsh, blaring red error tone. The Secret Service agent frowned, typing rapidly on his keyboard. He looked up at Desmond, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. He stated that the contractor clearance associated with the Apex Tech invitation had been flagged and suspended. Access was firmly denied. Desmond's confident smile vanished instantly. He slammed his fist on the podium, shouting that the machine was broken. He demanded that the agent call the chief of staff, immediately threatening to have the man fired for disrespecting a major federal contractor. Monica gasped, dramatically clutching Desmond's arm, while Bradley went completely pale. Bradley spun around and glared at me with absolute fury. He pointed his finger directly at my chest. He yelled that this was my fault. He claimed that because I had linked my basic federal employee number to their guest registration, my low-level clearance had triggered a security lockdown. He ordered me to get out of the line, demanding that I step away so I would not ruin the biggest night of his life. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against his baseless accusation. Instead, I stepped directly past my panicking husband and stood in front of the bewildered Secret Service agent. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a solid white, highly encrypted military identification card. It bore a specialized gold insignia that ordinary civilians never see. I placed it flat against the optical scanner. The machine chimed with a pleasant musical tone. The screen surrounding the podium instantly turned bright green, displaying a highly restricted clearance authorization. The Secret Service agent stared at the monitor. All the color drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the classified profile flashing across his screen. He swallowed hard, his hands actually trembling as he looked past me toward the heavily guarded rotunda. Standing near the inner doors was a formidable older man in a crisp naval uniform adorned with rows of service ribbons. It was Admiral Winston, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The young agent leaned around the bulletproof glass, his voice cracking slightly as he called out to the high-ranking officer. He stammered, telling the Admiral that she was here. Bradley scoffed loudly, attempting to grab my shoulder to pull me away from the podium. He hissed my name, telling me to stop playing games with the guards before we all got arrested. But Bradley never got the chance to touch me. Admiral Winston turned around, locked eyes with me, and marched straight past the velvet ropes. He completely ignored Desmond's furious shouting and Bradley's pathetic attempts to apologize for my behavior. The Four-Star Admiral stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He snapped his boots together, stood perfectly straight, and raised his hand in a sharp, flawless military salute. His booming voice echoed across the suddenly silent security checkpoint. He welcomed me back, calling me Colonel. He announced loud and clear that the President of the United States was waiting for my threat assessment briefing in the Oval Office. I am Kendra, 34 years old, and I spent my entire marriage hiding a massive secret from my husband to protect his fragile ego. While he treated me like a useless government clerk who barely earned her keep, I was actually commanding elite cyber warfare divisions for the United States military. My silence ended at a high-profile White House reception. Standing at the security checkpoint, my husband grabbed my arm, sneered at my outfit, and whispered a warning for me not to embarrass him in front of his wealthy brother-in-law. I did not argue. I simply handed the Secret Service agent my classified military credential and watched my husband's smug face completely shatter as a Four-Star Admiral rushed forward to salute me. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled his entire life that night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your light to keep a toxic partner comfortable. The evening air in Washington was crisp, and the security line outside the White House buzzed with senators, defense contractors, and high society elites. I stood quietly in my simple navy blue evening gown, keeping my posture perfectly straight, while the man I had been married to for 8 years sweated profusely in his custom Italian suit. Bradley kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, desperate to project an image of power and belonging. But the real source of his arrogance was standing right in front of us. Desmond, his sister's husband, was holding court. Desmond was a brilliant, self-made African-American tech billionaire who had built his company Apex Tech into a dominating force in the industry. Bradley rode his brother-in-law's coattails, relentlessly holding a hollow vice president title at Apex Tech that paid him an exorbitant salary for doing virtually nothing. Desmond was currently speaking loudly enough for the surrounding politicians to hear, bragging about the $500 million cybersecurity contract his company was slated to sign with the Pentagon the very next morning. His voice boomed over the polite chatter of the crowd, making bold promises about revolutionizing military data storage. His wife Monica stood beside him, dripping in diamonds and adjusting her designer fur wrap. Monica turned her gaze toward me, her eyes sweeping up and down my dress with undisguised contempt. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped closer to me. She asked if I had bought my dress at a discount outlet, her voice laced with poison. She told me this cheap off-the-rack look was completely inappropriate for a red carpet event. She suggested that once we got inside the reception, I should probably go stand in the corner near the coat check so people would not associate my poverty with their VIP table. She patted my shoulder condescendingly, adding that it was incredibly generous of Desmond to let me tag along, considering my pathetic civil service salary could barely cover the cost of their parking valet. I kept my face perfectly neutral, offering her a polite, tight smile. For 8 years, I had endured this exact brand of humiliation from my husband's family. They viewed me as a financial burden, a low-level public servant leeching off taxpayer money. Bradley had convinced them and himself that my job at the Department of Defense was nothing more than basic technical support. He loved to tell his wealthy friends that I reset passwords and fixed frozen computer screens for government bureaucrats. Whenever I tried to explain the actual scope of my work, Bradley would interrupt me, changing the subject to boast about his latest luxury car purchase or Desmond's soaring stock prices. Suddenly, Bradley yanked my arm, his grip digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my sleeve. He pulled me aside, his face twisted with anxiety and a fragile, threatened ego. He hissed at me to stop staring at Monica and show some respect to our providers. He reminded me that Desmond was about to secure the most lucrative defense contract in the history of Apex Tech, and my awkward low-income presence was already a massive liability. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my cheek, and warned me to keep my mouth shut when we reached the metal detectors. He told me not to embarrass him. He said I was just a mid-level IT clerk, and that if it were not for Desmond giving him his executive title, we would be living in a trailer on my pathetic government wages. He explicitly ordered me to step back and let Desmond do all the talking. I looked at the man I had married. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. I had spent the last 8 months quietly leading a covert audit of Apex Tech's network architecture for my department, and the terrifying things I had found in their code disgusted me even more than my husband's abusive behavior. But I could not reveal my hand just yet. I had to wait for the perfect moment to let the trap snap shut. We finally reached the front of the security line. A stern Secret Service agent stood behind a bulletproof podium, flanked by heavily armed military personnel. Desmond stepped up with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the country. He flashed a brilliant, arrogant smile, slapped his gold-trimmed VIP invitation onto the scanner, and loudly announced that he was the CEO of Apex Tech, arriving as a special guest of the Armed Services Committee. The scanner beeped. It was not a pleasant chime. It was a harsh, blaring red error tone. The Secret Service agent frowned, typing rapidly on his keyboard. He looked up at Desmond, his expression entirely devoid of warmth or deference. He stated flatly that the contractor clearance associated with the Apex Tech invitation had been flagged and suspended. Access was firmly denied. Desmond's confident smile vanished instantly. He slammed his fist on the podium, shouting that the machine was broken. He demanded that the agent call the chief of staff, immediately threatening to have the man fired and his career ruined for disrespecting a major federal contractor. Monica gasped, dramatically clutching Desmond's arm while Bradley went completely pale. Desperate to save face, Bradley spun around and glared at me with absolute fury. He pointed his finger directly at my chest, yelling that this was my fault. He claimed that because I had linked my basic federal employee number to their guest registration, my low-level clearance had triggered a security lockdown. He aggressively ordered me to get out of the line, demanding that I step away and take an Uber home so I would not ruin the biggest night of his life. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against his baseless screaming accusation. Instead, I stepped directly past my panicking husband and stood right in front of the bewildered Secret Service agent. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a solid white, highly encrypted military identification card. It bore a specialized holographic insignia that ordinary civilians never see. I placed it flat against the optical scanner. The machine chimed with a pleasant musical tone. The screen surrounding the podium instantly turned bright green, displaying a highly restricted level black clearance authorization. The Secret Service agent stared at the monitor. All the color drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the classified profile flashing across his screen. He swallowed hard, his hands actually trembling as he looked past me toward the heavily guarded rotunda. Standing near the inner doors was a formidable older man in a crisp naval uniform adorned with rows of service ribbons. It was Admiral Winston, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The young agent leaned around the bulletproof glass, his voice cracking slightly as he called out to the high-ranking officer. He stammered, telling the Admiral that she was here. I returned the Admiral's salute with crisp, practiced precision. Without a single backward glance at my husband's pale, trembling face or Desmond's open-mouthed shock, I stepped past the heavy velvet ropes of the security barricade. The thick oak doors of the White House Visitor Center closed firmly behind me, instantly cutting off the sounds of their frantic, outraged protests. The contrast between the chaotic, crowded security checkpoint and the hushed, deeply serious corridors of the West Wing was absolute. Walking alongside Admiral Winston, I felt my posture naturally shift. The heavy, invisible weight I had carried for 8 years simply evaporated. I was no longer the submissive, quiet wife desperately trying to shrink herself to fit inside Bradley's incredibly fragile ego. I was not the financial burden they mocked at family dinners. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States military, the director of National Cyber Threat Assessment, and I had a critical job to do. Deep inside the pocket of my uniform jacket, my personal cell phone began to vibrate. It buzzed once, then twice, then continuously, in a frantic, unbroken rhythm. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was causing the localized earthquake against my ribs. Bradley was experiencing a complete and total meltdown. As we approached the final security clearance station before the Oval Office, I pulled the phone out just long enough to silence the incoming barrage. The lock screen was completely littered with dozens of aggressive notifications. Bradley's texts were a chaotic, panicked mix of commands and desperate threats. He demanded I get back out to the lobby immediately and fix whatever computer glitch I had caused with my cheap badge. He accused me of trying to sabotage his prestigious career out of petty, bitter jealousy. He threatened that if I did not march out there and clear Desmond for entry that exact second, our marriage was entirely over. He typed in furious capital letters that I was ruining the absolute greatest night of his life and actively destroying a $500 million contract. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of peace as I swiped the screen and powered the device down completely. For 8 long years, those exact kinds of dramatic threats would have sent me into a severe spiral of anxiety. I would have spent the entire night desperately trying to appease him, apologizing profusely for things I had not even done, just to keep the fragile peace in our toxic home. Tonight, his pathetic tantrums meant absolutely nothing. I slid the dead phone back into my pocket, just as the Secret Service agents opened the heavy doors to the Oval Office. The room was already full of the most powerful people in the country. The president sat behind the resolute desk, flanked by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. The air in the room was thick with intense expectation. They were anticipating a routine final security briefing ahead of the massive Apex Tech contract signing scheduled for the following morning. They had no idea they were about to witness the systematic dismantling of a massive national security threat. Admiral Winston cleared his throat instantly, commanding the attention of the room. He introduced me formally, detailing my exact rank and my covert position at United States Cyber Command. I stepped up to the podium, connecting my encrypted military tablet to the secure projection system. The massive monitors mounted on the wall flickered to life, displaying thousands of lines of highly classified, incredibly complex source code. I looked directly at the president and began my briefing. I stated that for the past 8 months, my specialized covert team had been running a deep forensic audit on the proprietary software Apex Tech intended to sell to the Pentagon. Desmond had spent the last year aggressively marketing his system to generals and politicians as the ultimate impenetrable vault for classified military logistics and troop deployments. The $500 million price tag was supposedly justified by a revolutionary encryption algorithm that Desmond claimed to have personally engineered. I tapped my screen, highlighting a specific deeply buried cluster of code in bright, glaring red. I explained to the room that the system was indeed revolutionary, but not for the reasons Apex Tech claimed. The algorithm was not designed to protect our data. It was explicitly designed to siphon it. The room grew deathly quiet as I broke down the technical architecture step by step. I showed them exactly how the software contained a deeply embedded, highly sophisticated backdoor. I made it entirely clear that this was not a simple coding error. It was not a sloppy mistake made by a tired engineer rushing to meet a deadline. It was a deliberate architectural flaw carefully woven into the foundational fabric of the software. I explained that the exact moment this system went live on the Pentagon servers, it would begin quietly harvesting highly classified data, packaging it into untraceable encrypted microfiles, and routing it to offshore servers. The Secretary of Defense leaned forward, his face grim and tight with anger. He asked me directly who was on the receiving end of those offshore servers. I swiped to the next slide, bringing up a massive web of financial transactions and digital footprints my team had painstakingly traced over the last half year. I stated clearly, and without a single ounce of hesitation, that the data was being routed directly to hostile foreign adversaries. Desmond was not just a greedy tech billionaire looking to secure a lucrative government contract to boost his ego. He had intentionally engineered a massive cyber espionage trap. He was actively planning to sell out the United States military to the highest international bidder, and he was using his celebrated company as the Trojan horse to do it. The crushing gravity of the treason hung heavy in the air of the Oval Office. The president stared at the screens, his expression hardening into pure ice. He asked me if I was absolutely certain of these findings, knowing that acting on this information would destroy a titan of the tech industry. I stood perfectly straight, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. I replied that I was entirely certain, and that the architect of this treason was currently waiting in the outer visitor lobby, fully expecting to be handed $500 million of taxpayer money. The heavy silence in the Oval Office stretched for exactly 5 seconds before the room erupted into coordinated, lethal action. The president did not hesitate. He looked from the projected offshore routing numbers directly to the Secretary of Defense and gave a single definitive nod. The orders were issued instantly over secured comms. Federal agents were to be mobilized immediately. Corporate bank accounts were to be frozen worldwide. Federal warrants were to be executed without delay. Apex Tech was no longer considered a prestigious government contractor. It was an active, high-priority crime scene. Admiral Winston placed a firm, highly respectful hand on my shoulder, commending my division for intercepting what would have been the greatest intelligence heist of the decade. As I packed up my encrypted military tablet, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure wash over me. The immediate national security threat had been effectively neutralized. Now it was time to neutralize the toxic rot in my own personal life. I walked out of the West Wing, my combat boots clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floors. Secret Service agents who had just reviewed my level black clearance stepped aside, offering subtle deferential nods of respect. I navigated through the labyrinth of secure corridors, making my way back toward the outer visitor lobby. I fully expected my husband and his entitled family to have retreated to their luxury penthouse to lick their wounds and complain about the broken security system. I severely underestimated their sheer blinding arrogance. They had not left. Bradley, Desmond, and Monica were pacing the marble floor of the outer security perimeter like caged animals. They had somehow managed to badger the outer gate guards into letting them wait in the holding area, refusing to accept that they were being turned away. The moment the heavy glass doors opened and I stepped into the brightly lit lobby, all three of them locked eyes on me. They charged forward like a pack of rabid wolves, completely oblivious to the heavily armed federal police watching their every move. Monica reached me first. Her face was flushed red with absolute rage, her heavy diamond earrings shaking violently as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger mere inches from my face. She screamed that I was a jealous, vindictive nobody. Her shrill voice echoed off the high ceilings, drawing the immediate attention of every tourist and security guard in the room. She accused me of deliberately orchestrating a fake computer glitch just to ruin the greatest day of her husband's life. She yelled that I just could not stomach the idea of a self-made black man achieving historic excellence, and that I was actively trying to sabotage his billionaire status out of pure, bitter spite. She claimed I was nothing but a miserable low-income civil servant who would never amount to anything, and that my petty jealousy was destroying black-owned success. She demanded to know how much money I had scraped together to pay the security guard to play this sick, pathetic prank on them. Bradley shoved past his sister, his face completely drenched in panicked sweat. He did not ask what had happened inside. He did not stop to ask why I was wearing a highly decorated military uniform instead of my evening gown. His brain was so thoroughly washed in his own ego that he literally could not process reality. He grabbed my wrist, completely ignoring the military police officers who immediately stepped forward to intervene. I held up a single hand, signaling the guards to stand down. I wanted him to dig his own grave. Bradley demanded that I march straight back to whatever basement cubicle I worked in and manually override the security system immediately. He ordered me to type in whatever basic admin code I used to reset passwords and grant Desmond full VIP clearance right this second. He threatened that if I did not fix this glitch, he would make sure I was fired from my pathetic clerk job, blacklisted from government work, and left completely destitute. He screamed that I was actively destroying his career and single-handedly ruining his wealth. Desmond stood right behind them, crossing his arms with a look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He looked down his nose at me and stated that he was giving me exactly 1 minute to resolve this bureaucratic incompetence before he made a single phone call to his contacts in the Senate. He promised to have my pension stripped, my department defunded, and my entire life ruined by morning. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cry. I looked at the three people who had spent 8 long years making me feel like a worthless burden. I calmly pulled my wrist out of my husband's weak, trembling grip. I reached up and slowly, deliberately buttoned the front of my uniform jacket, letting my fingers brush past the silver oak leaf pinned to my lapel. I looked directly into Desmond's furious eyes. I told him that I could not override a clearance that no longer existed. I kept my voice perfectly steady, letting the cold, hard truth slice cleanly through their delusions of grandeur. I informed Desmond that as of 10 minutes ago, his coveted $500 million contract was dead, and his entire company was officially under federal investigation for severe violations of the Espionage Act. Leaving them reeling in the visitor lobby of the White House, I walked out to my car. The crisp evening air felt entirely different now. The drive back to my home in the Virginia suburbs gave me 30 minutes to process the sheer glorious panic I had just witnessed. I had walked away from Desmond, Monica, and Bradley while they were still frozen in absolute shock. I knew the federal agents would be keeping a very close eye on their movements, but they were free to go for the moment. The trap was firmly set, and the feds were just waiting to see who they called and where they tried to run. I pulled into my driveway. This house was a beautiful, sprawling property provided exclusively to high-ranking military officers, holding sensitive clearances. But Bradley had spent the last 5 years telling his wealthy friends that he paid the mortgage. He insisted on handling our shared finances, routing his money into a blind trust that covered the nominal neighborhood maintenance fees. He had completely convinced himself that he owned the property outright and he loved to use it as proof of his success as a corporate vice president. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I was immediately hit with the overwhelming scent of expensive, suffocating perfume. The entire family was waiting for me in my own living room. They had clearly raced back from the White House in a desperate, coordinated frenzy to intercept me. Sitting dead center on my custom sofa was Beatrice, my domineering mother-in-law. She was flanked by Monica, who was furiously typing on her phone with shaking hands. Bradley was pacing the hardwood floor with a heavy glass of scotch in his hand. Desmond was nowhere to be seen, likely holed up in a secure location, desperately trying to reach his expensive defense attorneys. Beatrice did not even wait for me to take off my uniform jacket. She stood up, her face a mask of furious aristocratic entitlement. She wore a tailored suit and glared at me as if I were an insubordinate servant. She slapped a thick manila folder down onto my glass coffee table. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the documents and ordered me to sit down and sign them immediately. I walked over slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and picked up the top sheet of paper. It was a pre-written resignation letter addressed to the Department of Defense. It stated that I was voluntarily stepping down from my military position due to severe mental exhaustion and hysterical jealousy. Attached to it was a drafted public apology to Apex Tech, claiming that I had fabricated the security threat because I was bitter and resentful about my husband's incredible financial success. Beatrice stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom. She told me that I was a complete disgrace to their prestigious family name. She said I had let my pathetic low-income inferiority complex ruin the greatest financial opportunity her son and son-in-law had ever created. She demanded that I sign the resignation release, the public statement, apologizing to the press, and do exactly as I was told. She hissed that I would not be allowed to ruin her son's legacy just because I was desperate for attention. She truly believed that throwing my career away could somehow stop a federal espionage investigation. I looked at the ridiculous piece of paper in my hand. Then I looked at Beatrice, whose face was turning red with exertion. I dropped the paper back onto the table and let out a genuine, effortless laugh. The sound echoed brightly in the tense living room, completely shattering their illusion of control. I told Beatrice that her son did not have a legacy. I told her that he was a willing participant in a massive federal crime, and that a fake apology letter drafted in my living room would not stop the Department of Justice from freezing every single bank account associated with their last name. My laughter made Bradley snap. He slammed his scotch glass down on the kitchen counter, the heavy thud cutting through the room. His face twisted into an ugly, arrogant sneer. He told me I was completely out of my mind if I thought I held any real power over him. He said he knew I was bluffing about the espionage investigation, claiming it was just a pathetic scare tactic designed by a jealous wife. He marched over to the front door, grabbed the handle, and ripped it open. Standing on my front porch was a stunning, much younger woman. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, a designer trench coat, and a massive, blinding diamond ring on her left hand. I recognized her immediately from my deep background checks on Apex Tech's payroll. Her name was Courtney. She was 29 years old and worked as a high-powered corporate lobbyist for Desmond's company. Bradley pulled Courtney into the house, wrapping his arm possessively around her waist. He looked at me with absolute triumphant malice, fully believing he was about to deliver the ultimate crushing blow to my self-esteem. He proudly announced that Courtney was his real partner, a woman who actually understood power, wealth, and fierce loyalty. He pointed aggressively at the resignation letter resting on the coffee table. He demanded that I sign it immediately, or he was filing for divorce first thing in the morning. He smirked, his chest puffed out with false bravado, and told me that Courtney was moving in, that they were taking this house, and that I would be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. Courtney stepped further into my living room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She carried herself with the exaggerated confidence of a woman who believed she had just won the ultimate prize. She tossed her expensive leather handbag onto my armchair and leaned against Bradley, wrapping her arm around his waist. As she moved, she deliberately raised her left hand, ensuring the massive blinding diamond ring on her finger caught the light from the chandelier overhead. It was a flawless custom-cut stone, undoubtedly paid for by the inflated Apex Tech salary Bradley had been collecting from his brother-in-law. Courtney looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, condescending smirk. She told me I needed to accept reality. She said Bradley was a high-powered executive who required a partner capable of navigating elite social circles, not a bitter government worker who brought down his image. She actually had the audacity to reach over and pick up a small framed photograph of Bradley and me from the side table, clicking her tongue in faux sympathy before placing it face down. She told me to just sign the papers and walk away quietly, promising that if I made this easy, she might let me keep some of the cheaper furniture when she redecorated the space. Monica, still hovering near the kitchen counter, clapped her hands together in delight. She loudly praised Bradley for finally finding a real woman. Beatrice nodded in absolute agreement, adjusting her tailored suit jacket. My mother-in-law stated that Courtney came from a respectable family of lobbyists and understood how the world of true power operated. Beatrice sneered at me, adding that I had overstayed my welcome in their prestigious family the moment I refused to fall in line and support her son's ambitions. Bradley was practically vibrating with arrogant triumph. He clearly believed that bringing his young, flashy mistress into my home and threatening me with destitution would finally break my spirit. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slamming them down onto the glass coffee table right next to the ridiculous resignation letter Beatrice had drafted. He pointed at the top document, loudly announcing that it was a finalized divorce petition. He then pointed to the second document, stating it was a quit-claim deed for the house. Bradley leaned over the table, his face twisted into a vicious, triumphant snarl. He told me he was taking absolutely everything. He reminded me that he had been the sole provider for our entire marriage. He shouted that he had paid the mortgage on this sprawling suburban estate for 5 long years, while I played soldier at my pathetic desk job. He demanded that I sign the deed over to him immediately, pack whatever cheap clothes I had upstairs, and get out of his house before he called the local police to have me removed for trespassing. I stood perfectly still, looking at the man I had shared my life with for nearly a decade. He was so blindingly arrogant, so completely consumed by his own fabricated superiority, that he had never once bothered to look at the actual paperwork he signed during our marriage. He had spent years handing his money over to a financial manager I had recommended, fully believing he was purchasing this multi-million-dollar estate. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg him to reconsider. I felt an overwhelming, brilliant wave of relief wash over my entire body. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform and pulled out my heavy metal fountain pen, the one engraved with the seal of the Department of Defense. I stepped up to the glass coffee table. I uncapped the pen, flipped open the divorce petition, and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, flawless precision. Bradley let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He wrapped his arm tighter around Courtney, boasting to his mother and sister that he knew I would eventually cave. He told them I was too weak to fight back, and that I knew I stood no chance against his high-priced corporate lawyers. Courtney giggled, leaning her head against his shoulder and whispering that they should celebrate with champagne once the trash was finally taken out. I calmly capped my pen. I picked up the signed divorce petition and tucked it safely into my own uniform pocket. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I slid the quitclaim deed and the military resignation letter back across the glass table until they bumped directly against Bradley's hands. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I would not be signing the deed, and I certainly would not be resigning from my command. Bradley's smug smile vanished instantly. His face flushed bright red with sudden explosive anger. He slammed his fist onto the coffee table, rattling the glass. He screamed that I did not have a choice. He yelled that he had paid the massive mortgage every single month for 5 years out of his own Apex Tech salary. He demanded to know how I thought a low-income government clerk could possibly claim ownership of a property he had financed. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting my words drop like heavy stones into the tense silence of the living room. I told Bradley that he had never paid a single cent toward a mortgage. I explained that for the last 5 years, his monthly housing payments had been routed directly into a blind high-yield investment trust that sat entirely in my name. I had set it up legally and cleanly, framing it as a neighborhood maintenance and future investment fund that he had willingly signed off on, without ever reading the fine print. Bradley stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as his brain desperately tried to process what I was saying. Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest, while Monica froze entirely. Courtney dropped her hand from Bradley's waist, suddenly looking very unsure of her surroundings. I took a step forward, closing the distance between me and my soon-to-be ex-husband. I gestured around the spacious, beautifully appointed living room. I informed him that there was no mortgage on this house because it was not a private civilian residence. I told him that this entire property was classified highly secure military housing, provided exclusively by the federal government to ranking officers operating at level black clearance. I stated that the federal government owned the ground we were standing on, the walls surrounding us, and the roof over our heads. Bradley's eyes darted wildly around the room as the crushing reality of his massive delusion finally began to set in. He had spent years bragging to his elite social circle about purchasing a luxury estate that he was actually just living in as a dependent spouse of a military officer. I turned my gaze to Courtney, who was now visibly trembling under her expensive designer coat. I looked her up and down, making sure she understood exactly how much danger she had just walked into. I told Bradley that by bringing Courtney into my home, he had made a catastrophic error. I explained that because Courtney was an unregistered foreign lobbyist, heavily involved in Desmond's corrupt international tech deals, her very presence on this classified military property was a severe breach of national security. I informed them both that by forcing her across the threshold of this heavily monitored federal facility, they were currently committing a federal felony. The heavy, suffocating silence in my living room was suddenly broken by a loud, booming laugh. Desmond clapped his hands together slowly, stepping forward to push past his panicking brother-in-law. He looked at Bradley with utter disgust, telling him to stop shaking like a coward just because a bitter woman was throwing around some legal jargon. Then Desmond turned his attention entirely to me. He pulled his custom gold-trimmed smartphone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He looked me up and down with an expression of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He told me I was playing a cute little game with real estate technicalities, but I was completely out of my depth. He said I was nothing but a glorified government employee who thought wearing a uniform suddenly made her powerful. He took another step closer, holding his phone up between us. He asked if I really thought I could intimidate him with bureaucratic nonsense. He told me to watch closely as he ended my entire life. Desmond tapped his screen with deliberate theatrical movements. He made a grand show of navigating to his contacts, pressing the speaker button, and placing the phone right in the center of the glass coffee table right next to the divorce papers I had just signed. He addressed the room, puffing out his chest. He told Beatrice and Monica to pay attention and watch how a true billionaire handles a minor inconvenience. He looked directly into my eyes and explained that he had a very specific, highly influential senator on speed dial, a man who sat directly on the Armed Services Committee, a man whose political campaigns Desmond had personally funded through heavily disguised offshore political action committees. Desmond bragged that money was the only real currency in Washington, not medals, and certainly not military ranks. He promised that with one single phone call, he would have my level black security clearance permanently revoked. He said he was going to tell the senator that I was having a severe psychotic break, that I was harassing federal contractors, and that I needed to be detained by military police and immediately court-martialed. The phone on the glass table began to ring. The loud, rhythmic tone echoed through the tense living room. Courtney, the lobbyist who had been trembling just moments before, suddenly found her false courage again. She adjusted her designer coat and smirked at me. She boasted that the Senator Desmond was calling owed her firm dozens of massive political favors. She told me I had really messed up this time, and that I should have just signed the house over quietly when I had the chance. Bradley stood up straighter, riding Desmond's coattails, once again nodding eagerly in agreement. I stood perfectly still. I did not reach for the phone. I did not try to stop the call. I did not say a single word to defend myself. I simply watched the glowing screen on the table, knowing exactly what was happening in the Capitol at this very second. I remembered the exact, definitive nod the president had given in the Oval Office. I knew the absolute terrifying synchronization of a federal strike. The phone rang a second time, then a third. Finally, the ringing stopped. The line clicked open. Desmond leaned down toward the microphone on the table. His voice dripped with absolute, unquestionable authority. He barked the senator's name. He started demanding immediate aggressive action. He ordered the senator to contact the Pentagon right that second and have a lieutenant colonel removed from her post, stripped of her rank, and escorted off federal property. But the voice that came through the speaker was not the smooth, polished, confident tone of a powerful Washington politician. It was a frantic, breathless, utterly terrified voice. It was the senator's chief of staff. The man on the other end of the line was practically hyperventilating. His voice cracked as he shouted into the receiver. He screamed for Desmond to listen to him very carefully. He yelled, "Desmond, do not come to D.C. Whatever you do, do not come to the Capitol." Desmond frowned deeply, his arrogant smile faltering for the first time all evening. He demanded to know what was going on. He angrily asked why the chief of staff was answering the private line and demanded to be put through to the senator immediately. The chief of staff screamed through the speaker, the audio distorting from the sheer volume of his panic. He shouted that the senator was gone. He yelled that the FBI was currently raiding their offices. He sobbed into the phone, screaming that federal agents were seizing all the servers, tearing apart the hard drives, and locking down the entire building. Desmond froze. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving an ashen, terrified expression behind. The chief of staff continued to scream through the speaker, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "They have the wiretaps, Desmond. They have everything. They know about the offshore accounts. They know about the data transfers." A loud, violent crash echoed suddenly through the phone speaker. It sounded like a heavy wooden door being kicked open. In the background, loud, authoritative voices could be heard shouting orders for everyone to step away from their computers and put their hands in the air. A scuffle broke out, and the phone line went completely, horrifyingly dead. The silence that fell over my living room was suffocating. Desmond stared down at his glowing phone screen. His hands began to tremble so violently that he had to pull them back against his chest. His billionaire swagger, his absolute certainty that his wealth made him a god among men, completely evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. He took a staggering, unsteady step backward. The expensive smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers, crashing down onto the glass coffee table with a sharp, cracking thud. The screen of Desmond's custom smartphone lay dark against the shattered glass of my coffee table. The heavy thud of the device hitting the surface had spiderwebbed the glass outward, creating a perfect physical metaphor for his suddenly shattered billionaire empire. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in my living room was the ragged, uneven breathing of my brother-in-law. Desmond stumbled backward away from the table. His knees hit the edge of my sofa, and he practically collapsed onto the cushions, his hands flying up to grip his head in absolute disbelief. Monica rushed to his side, her heavy diamond earrings swinging wildly. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, demanding to know who was on the phone and what a wiretap meant. Desmond could not even form a coherent sentence. His eyes were wide and vacant. He just kept staring at the floor, muttering under his breath that it was over, that they had everything, that the feds were inside his servers. Beatrice, completely incapable of understanding anything outside her narrow world of country club gossip, turned her fury back to me. She clutched the pearls at her throat and accused me of playing some sort of elaborate, cruel prank. She demanded that I explain what kind of fake audio I had just routed through Desmond's device. She actually believed I had hired actors to stage a fake FBI raid just to scare them. Bradley, completely oblivious to the massive federal hammer that had just swung down on his entire family, stepped squarely in front of Courtney. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to play the protective alpha male for his young, terrified mistress. He told his mother to ignore my pathetic games. He sneered, stating that I was just throwing a childish tantrum because he was divorcing me and taking my home. He promised Beatrice that my little parlor tricks would not stop him from throwing me out onto the street. Then we heard it, the heavy, synchronized, unmistakable rhythm of combat boots marching up my front concrete walkway. A second later, the harsh glare of flashing red and blue lights suddenly bathed my living room walls in frantic color, slicing through the sheer curtains of my front windows. Bradley smiled. A genuine, victorious smile spread across his arrogant face. He actually believed the authorities were here to save him. He pointed a finger directly at me and proudly declared that the neighborhood security patrol must have heard my hysterical screaming. He told Courtney to relax, promising her that I was finally going to be dragged out of his house in a straitjacket. He confidently strode toward the entryway to welcome his rescuers. The heavy oak front door was suddenly thrust wide open. 3 military police officers marched into the foyer. They were not local neighborhood watch guards, and they were certainly not standard beat cops. They were fully geared, highly trained federal officers wearing tactical vests, heavy-duty utility belts, and stern, unyielding expressions. Bradley immediately stepped forward to meet them, raising his hands in a calming, condescending gesture. He played the part of the exhausted, patient husband dealing with an irrational wife perfectly. He told the officers he was incredibly glad they had arrived so quickly. He confidently stated that he was the homeowner, the primary taxpayer, and that he needed them to arrest me immediately. He claimed I was having a severe psychotic breakdown, that I was verbally threatening his prominent family, and that I was refusing to leave his property peacefully. He pointed back at Courtney, who was cowering near the armchair, claiming she was his primary witness to my dangerous domestic distress. Courtney nodded eagerly, clinging tightly to her expensive leather handbag. She told the officers that I was completely unhinged and that I had been making terroristic threats against a billionaire. The lead military police officer, a tall man with a jaw carved from absolute granite, did not even look at Bradley. He did not acknowledge Courtney. He did not ask for Bradley's identification, and he certainly did not listen to a single word of his pathetic, fabricated story. The officer marched directly past my soon-to-be ex-husband, moving with terrifying, disciplined purpose. He stopped precisely 2 feet in front of me, snapped his heavy boots together, and delivered a crisp, flawless military salute. He addressed me loud and clear. He stated that the outer perimeter was fully secured and asked for my immediate orders, Colonel. Bradley's jaw dropped open. He looked from the heavily armed tactical officer to me, his brain completely failing to process the reality unfolding in front of his eyes. He stammered, stepping forward with his hands raised. He asked the officer why he was calling his crazy civilian wife a colonel. He demanded that the officer listen to him, loudly reiterating that he paid the mortgage on this house. I did not look at Bradley. I kept my eyes locked on the lead officer. I returned the salute and lowered my hand. I informed the officer that I had a severe security breach. I stated with absolute icy calm that the 5 individuals currently standing in my living room were unauthorized civilians trespassing on classified federal property. I pointed specifically at Courtney, noting for the official record that she was an unregistered foreign lobbyist representing an active and severe national security risk to my command. The lead officer turned around. He dropped his hand to his utility belt. The absolute uncompromising authority in his eyes made Beatrice gasp and shrink back into the sofa beside a still paralyzed Desmond. The officer unclipped the radio at his shoulder, briefly signaling to his team stationed outside the front door. Then he looked directly at Bradley, who was now trembling with newfound terror. The officer's voice was like gravel and steel. He informed the entire room that this property was a restricted, highly classified military zone. He stated that their civilian presence here was a direct violation of federal law. He pulled a heavy tactical watch from his pocket and looked down at it. He gave them exactly 5 minutes to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. He stepped forward, forcing Bradley to stumble backward toward the door. The officer warned them that if a single one of them was still standing inside the walls of this house, when the timer ran out, they would all be leaving in federal handcuffs. The morning sun had barely crested over the heavily fortified concrete structures of United States Cyber Command at Fort Meade when the full scale of the retaliation hit. I swiped my encrypted badge at the primary entry gate, navigating the multiple layers of biometric security, with my usual practiced precision. The military police officers stationed at the heavily armored doors offered their standard sharp salutes as I passed, but I could immediately sense a thick, uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. The moment I stepped onto the main operations floor, I understood exactly why. The massive digital monitors mounted across the walls of the command center were designed to track global network vulnerabilities and active hostile cyber threats. Instead, every single screen was tuned to major cable news networks, and my face was plastered across all of them. Desmond and Courtney had not spent the night sleeping. They had deployed the massive, seemingly unlimited financial resources of Apex Tech to initiate a highly coordinated, vicious public relations smear campaign. Courtney had clearly weaponized her extensive network of corrupt political connections and high-paid media fixers to flood the morning news cycles with a completely fabricated narrative. I stood in the center of the command floor and watched a prominent news anchor read from a teleprompter with an expression of manufactured outrage. A bold, glaring graphic flashed across the bottom of the screen. It labeled me a rogue, bitter military wife deliberately sabotaging a visionary tech company. The media spin was masterfully deceptive. Desmond was playing the ultimate victim. His highly paid spokespeople had issued press releases claiming that his historic $500 million Pentagon contract was being derailed by an unstable, low-ranking government employee who had abused her minimal security clearance to orchestrate a personal vendetta. They completely erased my actual rank and command status from the narrative, reducing me to a jealous, hysterical spouse lashing out over a failing marriage. Even worse, they were actively trying to paint my actions as racially motivated. Desmond released a statement claiming that his success as a self-made African-American tech billionaire had made me fiercely resentful. He argued that I could not stomach the idea of a powerful black man securing the largest defense contract of the decade, so I had fabricated a fake security threat to destroy black-owned excellence. Another monitor showed footage of my sister-in-law, Monica. She was standing outside a luxury hotel wearing oversized sunglasses and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue for the cameras. She sobbed directly into the microphones, claiming her family was being targeted and harassed by a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Then came the interview with Bradley. My soon-to-be ex-husband sat in a brightly lit television studio looking perfectly disheveled and deeply traumatized. He looked directly into the camera lens and told a national audience that I had suffered a severe psychotic break. He claimed he had spent years trying to get me the psychiatric help I so desperately needed, but my delusions had finally spilled over into my professional life. He begged the Department of Defense to intervene before my severe mental illness destroyed his brother-in-law's innocent, groundbreaking technology firm. The junior officers and technical analysts seated at the long rows of computer terminals quickly averted their eyes as I walked past. The entire division was watching the national media demand my immediate resignation. Pundits on every major network were shouting for a congressional inquiry into how a supposedly unstable woman was allowed to retain any level of federal employment. I did not flinch. I did not alter my stride or lower my head. I marched straight through the center of the operations floor, my combat boots echoing firmly against the tile. Before I could even reach my private office, my secure comms unit chimed. It was a direct summons from Admiral Winston. I walked down the secure executive corridor and entered the Admiral's briefing room. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind me, completely blocking out the noise of the operations floor. Admiral Winston stood behind his massive desk, his hands resting firmly on the polished wood. He looked incredibly grave. The bank of televisions in his office was also broadcasting the vicious smear campaign. He turned to me, his voice low and tight, with barely suppressed anger. He stated that the political pressure mounting on the Pentagon was absolutely immense. Courtney had called in every single favor she had in Washington. Several prominent senators, clearly backed by Desmond's dark money political action committees, had already contacted the Secretary of Defense directly. They were aggressively demanding my immediate suspension pending a full public investigation into my conduct. Admiral Winston warned me that the narrative Desmond was spinning was incredibly dangerous. The public was entirely buying the story of the brilliant victimized tech billionaire being targeted by a rogue, unstable wife. He said the media circus was creating a massive distraction, and the politicians whose pockets Desmond lined were using the manufactured outrage to try and force the Pentagon to reinstate the Apex Tech contract. The Admiral looked at me with deep concern. He asked me how I wanted to handle the catastrophic damage to my reputation. I stood at parade rest, keeping my breathing perfectly slow and controlled. I did not show a single ounce of panic or distress. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket. I pulled out a small, heavy titanium flash drive encrypted with military-grade security protocols. I stepped forward and placed it squarely in the center of the Admiral's desk. I looked at the television screen where Bradley was currently wiping away a fake tear for the morning talk show audience. I turned my gaze back to Admiral Winston. I told him to let them run the story. I stated that every single time Desmond paid a news network to broadcast his lies, and every time Courtney bribed a politician to demand my suspension, they were exposing another node in their corrupt network. I explained that their massive public relations campaign was not a threat to our operation. It was a fatal mistake. I pointed to the titanium flash drive resting on the polished wood. I told the Admiral that Desmond's loud, desperate screaming was only serving to make our federal trap tighter. I informed him that the drive contained the exact unredacted offshore routing numbers linking Apex Tech directly to foreign intelligence agencies. I walked out of Admiral Winston's office with a clear, definitive mandate. The titanium flash drive I had placed on his desk was already being authenticated by the highest levels of military intelligence. Now it was time to reel the targets in. I knew exactly how to manipulate their massive inflated egos. I had a federal liaison draft, an urgent, highly confidential summons inviting Desmond and Bradley to the Pentagon under the strict guise of an emergency settlement negotiation. The message was carefully worded to sound like a desperate plea from a panicked government agency trying to quietly settle a public relations nightmare before it escalated any further. I knew they would not be able to resist the opportunity to gloat in person. 4 hours later, my secure terminal notified me that they had arrived at the outer security gate. I sat in the observation room and watched the live security feeds as my soon-to-be ex-husband and his billionaire brother-in-law strutted through the heavily fortified corridors of the Pentagon. They walked with the exaggerated, arrogant swagger of men who believed they had just successfully bullied the United States military into submission. They did not come alone. Desmond had brought a team of 3 high-priced defense attorneys. These were men in sharp, custom-tailored suits, carrying expensive Italian leather briefcases, lawyers who charged $1,000 an hour to intimidate rivals in plush corporate boardrooms. They walked with their heads held high, completely unaware that they were marching directly into a federal trap. I had security escort them deep into the subterranean levels of the building. They were not led to a standard administrative conference room with large windows and comfortable executive chairs. They were brought to a sensitive, compartmented information facility known as a SCIF. It was a sterile, windowless interrogation room, constructed entirely of reinforced steel lined with acoustic dampening panels and bathed in harsh fluorescent light. The room was explicitly designed for interrogating high-value espionage targets. But Bradley and Desmond were far too consumed by their own fabricated victory to notice the heavy vault door or the complete lack of cell phone reception inside the reinforced walls. I waited exactly 15 minutes, letting them stew in the sterile environment, before I finally opened the heavy steel door and stepped inside. Bradley was sitting with his feet propped up carelessly on the cold metal interrogation table. The moment I walked into the room, a massive, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He did not stand up. He did not show a single ounce of respect for my uniform or the federal facility we were standing in. He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. He asked me if I was finally ready to beg for my job back. He proudly boasted that their morning news campaign had completely destroyed my reputation across the entire country. He crossed his arms behind his head and stated that Courtney had already finalized a press release for me to read. He demanded that I sign over the deed to our house, surrender my entire military pension to him as alimony, and issue a highly publicized apology to Apex Tech. He promised that if I followed his instructions perfectly, he might ask Desmond to call off his attack dogs in the media and let me keep a low-level desk job somewhere in the government. Desmond leaned back in his rigid metal chair, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer suit. He complained loudly about the depressing windowless room I had chosen for this meeting. He tapped his luxury watch and rudely informed me that his time was worth thousands of dollars a minute. He told me to stop wasting his day and just hand over the settlement paperwork so his legal team could authorize the surrender. He sneered, stating that this was what happened when a minor public servant tried to pick a fight with true, untouchable wealth. The three expensive defense attorneys sat silently with their briefcases resting on their laps. Unlike Bradley and Desmond, the lawyers were beginning to look incredibly uncomfortable. Their sharp eyes darted around the sterile room, taking in the reinforced acoustic panels and the distinct, unmistakable setup of a federal interrogation facility. They were starting to realize this was not a standard civil negotiation, but they were too arrogant to speak up and stop their billionaire client from talking. I did not react to Bradley's delusional demands. I did not flinch at Desmond's insults. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I walked slowly over to the heavy steel vault door. I grabbed the massive metal handle and pulled it shut. The thick locking mechanisms engaged with a loud, heavy, terrifying mechanical click that echoed sharply against the bare walls. I turned around and walked over to the security control panel mounted on the wall. I flipped a heavy red switch, disabling the visible recording lights on the ceiling cameras. I looked directly at the three defense attorneys and told them that this room was now operating strictly off the record. I walked to the head of the metal table. I lifted a massive 500-page physical dossier that I had brought in with me. I slammed it down onto the steel surface. The incredibly loud, violent crash made Bradley flinch and immediately drop his feet to the floor. Desmond jumped in his seat, his arrogant smirk instantly vanishing. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the cold steel table. I looked Bradley dead in the eyes, stripping away the last remaining shred of his fragile ego. I kept my voice quiet, icy, and completely uncompromising. I told them I was not here to negotiate. I was here to accept their unconditional surrender. The harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room seemed to hum with the sudden, suffocating tension. I kept my hands planted firmly on the massive dossier I had just slammed onto the steel table. Desmond stared at the thick stack of paper, his billionaire swagger momentarily paralyzed by the sheer volume of evidence resting beneath my palms. The three expensive defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their metal chairs, exchanging nervous glances. They were high-powered corporate lawyers, and they could smell a fatal legal trap from a mile away. But Bradley was utterly incapable of reading the room. His fragile ego simply could not process the reality of his situation. He refused to accept that the woman he had spent 8 years treating like a financially dependent burden was currently holding his entire life in her hands. Bradley let out a loud, arrogant scoff, breaking the silence. He pushed his chair back roughly and stood up, straightening his custom suit jacket. He walked around the table, positioning himself between me and his legal team, desperately trying to reclaim control of the room. He told the lawyers to relax, waving his hand dismissively at my dossier. He confidently stated that this was just another one of my pathetic theatrical stunts. He claimed I had probably printed out hundreds of pages of useless tech support manuals just to look intimidating. I did not argue with him. I simply stepped away from the table and walked over to the secure digital interface mounted on the reinforced wall. I pulled a secondary encrypted drive from my uniform pocket and inserted it into the command port. With a sharp mechanical click, the high-definition projector suspended from the ceiling powered on. A massive wall of the windowless room was instantly illuminated with a brilliant blue glow. Thousands of lines of highly complex, heavily obfuscated source code began scrolling rapidly across the steel surface. It was the exact proprietary architecture of the software Apex Tech was attempting to sell to the Pentagon. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest and let out a condescending chuckle. He turned to face the projected code, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. He told me I was embarrassing myself in front of highly paid professionals. He marched directly up to the illuminated wall and pointed his finger at a dense block of alphanumeric text. He looked back at his lawyers with a smug, victorious grin. He announced that he was going to explain this to his simple wife, using small words so she could understand. He confidently declared that the code I was trying to make look scary was nothing more than a standard diagnostic interface. He started throwing around technical buzzwords with absolutely zero context, trying to sound like a visionary tech executive. He claimed the text block was just a blockchain cloud protocol designed to optimize the mainframe graphical user interface. He told the room that any entry-level intern would recognize it as a harmless routine data formatting loop. I watched the three defense attorneys slowly lower their gaze to the floor. They were not programmers, but they were intelligent men. They could hear the absolute fabricated nonsense pouring out of Bradley's mouth. They realized instantly that the vice president of Apex Tech was a pure nepotism hire who had absolutely no idea how his own company's technology actually functioned. I let Bradley finish his embarrassing display of unearned confidence. I let him bask in his own manufactured superiority for exactly 10 seconds. Then I stepped forward. I kept my voice perfectly level and icy cold. I informed my soon-to-be ex-husband that his explanation was complete garbage. I told him that there was no such thing as a blockchain cloud protocol in this operating environment, and that he was pointing at a highly restricted kernel-level execution command. I stepped right beside him, pointing my own finger at the exact same block of text. I flawlessly dissected the syntax line by line. I explained to the silent room that what Bradley had just called a harmless diagnostic loop was actually an automated, deeply embedded packet sniffing trigger. I broke down the logic flaw in his pathetic explanation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man collecting millions of dollars in executive compensation could not even read basic Python or C++. I told Bradley he was nothing but a hollow suit, a useless figurehead who had spent years cashing Desmond's checks while remaining completely ignorant of the weapon he was helping to build. Bradley's face flushed a deep, violent red. His mouth opened to stammer a defense, but Desmond finally snapped out of his shock. Desmond slammed his hand on the metal table and screamed for Bradley to shut up and sit down. Desmond's eyes were wide with sudden, terrifying realization. He was looking at me not as a bitter wife, but as a highly trained cyber warfare specialist who had just completely unmasked his architecture. I did not stop there. I stepped closer to the digital projection. I tapped the wall, freezing the scrolling code on a deeply buried, heavily encrypted data routing subroutine. I addressed the defense attorneys directly, ignoring Bradley and Desmond entirely. I explained how this specific architecture was explicitly designed to bypass the standard Defense Department firewalls. I showed them how the code automatically collected classified troop deployment schedules, compressed them into microscopic encrypted payloads, and prepared them for unauthorized extraction. Then I pulled out a wireless command remote. I told the room that we were going to run a live trace on the embedded routing protocol. I pressed a single button. The screen shifted from static code to a dynamic global tracking map. A bright red line shot out from the simulated Pentagon server, immediately jumping to an anonymous proxy server in the Cayman Islands. The lawyers watched in horrified fascination as the trace bounced rapidly across the globe. It hit a dummy corporation in Switzerland, routed through a compromised network in Eastern Europe, and bypassed 3 different digital anonymizers. I narrated the trace exactly as it happened, my voice echoing off the acoustic panels. I explained that this was not a glitch or a developer error. This was a masterfully engineered, deliberate pipeline designed for continuous data exfiltration. The red line on the map finally stopped jumping. It locked onto a hard-coded static server destination. The final IP address flashed onto the massive screen in bold, undeniable lettering. I read the destination aloud. I confirmed the exact geographic coordinates and the registered owner of the server farm. I stated clearly for the official record that the data stolen by Apex Tech was programmed to be deposited directly into the hands of a highly classified, aggressively hostile foreign intelligence agency. I turned away from the screen and looked at the men sitting at the steel table. I had just proved beyond any reasonable doubt that they were actively committing treason against the United States of America. The interrogation room went dead silent. The dead silence in the interrogation room was absolute and terrifying. For several agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The glowing red coordinates on the projection screen burned into the retinas of every single person sitting at the cold steel table. I had just laid out irrefutable, undeniable proof of high treason against the United States government, and the crushing reality of that word was suffocating. The three high-powered defense attorneys were the first to move. They did not speak a single word to Desmond. They did not ask for clarification, demand a recess, or try to mount a fabricated defense. These men were highly experienced veterans of the corporate legal world. They knew the distinct difference between defending a wealthy client against white-collar tax evasion and sitting in a secured federal facility as an accessory to international espionage. The lead attorney, a man who had spent the last hour radiating untouchable arrogance, reached forward with violently shaking hands. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp click, and stood up. His two junior associates mirrored his movements with frantic, panicked speed. They were literally sweeping their blank legal pads off the table, terrified of leaving even a single stray fingerprint near my classified dossier. Desmond finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He jumped out of his rigid metal chair, his expensive designer suit wrinkling as he reached out to grab the lead attorney firmly by the arm. He demanded to know exactly where they were going. He shouted that he was paying them $1,000 an hour to handle this minor bureaucratic misunderstanding. He aggressively ordered them to sit back down and draft a non-disclosure agreement immediately. The lead attorney violently yanked his arm out of Desmond's grip. He looked at the billionaire not with professional respect, but with pure, unadulterated disgust. The lawyer stated with absolute terrifying clarity that there was no amount of money on earth that could buy a defense for treason. He informed Desmond that effective immediately, their prestigious law firm was completely dropping Apex Tech as a client. He advised Desmond to sit down, keep his mouth tightly shut, and wait patiently for a federal public defender. Without another word, the three lawyers marched directly to the heavy steel door. I pressed the release button on my command console, allowing the heavy vault door to swing open just long enough for the attorneys to sprint out into the sterile corridor. The thick metal door slammed shut behind them, sealing the room once again and locking the trap. Desmond was left standing completely exposed in the harsh fluorescent light. The impenetrable armor of his vast wealth had vanished in an instant. He was no longer a visionary tech titan or an untouchable Silicon Valley billionaire. He was a trapped rat on a rapidly sinking ship, and the freezing water of federal justice was pouring in from every side. Panic set in completely. Desmond spun around, his eyes wild, darting, and desperate. He looked at the projected code on the wall, then at the thick dossier resting on the table, and finally his gaze locked intensely onto Bradley. The shift was instantaneous and incredibly violent. Desmond lunged across the narrow space, grabbing Bradley fiercely by the lapels of his custom Italian suit. He slammed my husband backward against the acoustic steel wall of the interrogation room. Bradley let out a high-pitched yelp of pure terror, his hands coming up to weakly push against his brother-in-law's chest. Desmond screamed inches from Bradley's face. He shouted that he was absolutely not going down for this. He roared that he was the CEO, the big-picture visionary, and he explicitly did not handle the day-to-day technical operations. Desmond wildly pointed at the projection on the wall, screaming that Bradley was the vice president of logistics. He yelled to the empty room and directly to me that Bradley was the one who had physically signed the final authorization for the foreign data transfer protocols. Bradley was hyperventilating. His face was entirely devoid of color, and cold sweat poured down his forehead. He desperately shook his head, crying out that he had no idea what he was signing. He sobbed uncontrollably, pleading with Desmond to tell the truth, crying that Desmond had just put a massive stack of paperwork on his desk and told him to sign it to secure his multi-million-dollar end-of-year bonus. Desmond shoved Bradley hard against the wall again, his voice echoing loudly off the panels. He stated maliciously that ignorance was not a valid legal defense in federal court. He screamed that Bradley's digital signature was on every single federal compliance form, making Bradley the sole architect of the data breach. Desmond was frantically, viciously throwing my husband under the proverbial bus, fully prepared to sacrifice Bradley to buy himself even a sliver of plausible deniability. Bradley slid down the wall, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He collapsed onto the cold floor of the interrogation room, pulling his knees tightly to his chest. The arrogant man who had spent 8 years treating me like a worthless financial burden, the man who had proudly brought his lobbyist mistress into my living room just 24 hours ago, was now reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely filled with desperate, groveling terror. He realized with absolute certainty that Desmond had meticulously set him up as the perfect fall guy. Bradley crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his expensive suit across the floor until he was right at the tips of my combat boots. He reached out his shaking hands, hovering just inches from my uniform, too afraid to actually touch me. He looked up at me with heavy tears streaming down his face. He begged me to help him. He cried that I knew he was too incredibly stupid to write that sophisticated code. He pleaded with me to tell the federal prosecutors that Desmond was manipulating him. Then Bradley played what he genuinely believed was his absolute final foolproof card. He looked up at me, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic hope. He begged me to invoke spousal privilege. He pleaded with me to use our sacred marriage to protect him. He cried that as his legally wedded wife, I could not be forced to testify against him in federal court. He begged me to claim marital privilege so I would not have to hand over my forensic audit to the Department of Justice. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the broken man weeping at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I kept my voice completely devoid of emotion, sharp and precise as a scalpel. I asked him why on earth he thought spousal privilege applied here. Bradley blinked through his tears, confusion mixing heavily with his blind panic. He stammered that we were married, that I was his wife, and that the law protected us. I looked down at him coldly. I informed Bradley that a federal judge had reviewed the highly classified circumstances of this espionage investigation early this morning. I stated that due to his active involvement in a massive national security threat, the judge had immediately expedited my emergency filing. I told him that as of 8 o'clock this morning, our divorce was entirely finalized. We aren't married. The flashing cameras of the assembled media outside the Pentagon did not faze me. I stepped out of the heavy, bulletproof glass doors of the visitor center, the early morning sun glinting off the newly pinned Brigadier General star on my shoulder. I had spent 8 long years shrinking myself, swallowing the daily, casual cruelty of a man who believed my only value was as a silent, compliant accessory to his manufactured corporate success. I had allowed Bradley, Desmond, Monica, and Beatrice to treat me like an unwanted, embarrassing burden. I had listened to them mock my civil service, insult my intelligence, and aggressively try to force me out of my own home so a 29-year-old unregistered foreign lobbyist could take my place. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cool Washington air, ignoring the frantic, shouted questions from the reporters cordoned off behind the security barricades. The same reporters who just 30 days ago had gleefully broadcast Desmond's million-dollar smear campaign labeling me a jealous, unstable, rogue military wife. Now they were falling over themselves to get a quote from the woman who had just dismantled a $500 million treasonous espionage ring from the inside out. Admiral Winston walked beside me, his own chest heavy with ribbons, offering a quiet, respectful nod to the heavily armed military police officers securing our perimeter. He commented on the remarkable swiftness of the federal indictments, noting that Desmond's entire empire had crumbled with astonishing speed once the offshore routing numbers were fully decrypted and verified by the Department of Justice. I did not feel the need to gloat. The profound, beautiful silence of my phone, which had previously been a constant source of Bradley's panicked, abusive threats, was all the victory I needed. Desmond was currently sitting in a federal holding facility facing a minimum of 20 years for severe violations of the Espionage Act. His desperate attempts to throw Bradley under the bus had failed spectacularly, Once Courtney, realizing the billionaire's accounts were frozen, immediately flipped on them both to secure her own immunity. The corrupt senator, who had so arrogantly attempted to ruin my career at Desmond's command, had resigned in absolute disgrace the moment the FBI raided his offices and seized his encrypted communications. And then there was Bradley. As Admiral Winston and I approached the final security checkpoint leading to the executive parking garage, a battered, rusted delivery van rattled to a halt just outside the heavy steel gates. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the sleek black government SUVs lining the perimeter. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting uniform stepped out of the driver's side, awkwardly juggling a massive stack of brown paper bags and cardboard drink carriers. He was visibly sweating, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill as he hurried toward the armed guards to deliver the breakfast order. I recognized the nervous, frantic energy immediately. It was Bradley. He was out on bail, his massive corporate salary completely seized by the federal government, his luxury cars repossessed, and his elite social status entirely annihilated. The man who had proudly bragged about paying a mortgage that never existed, the man who had laughed in my face and told me he was leaving me with nothing, was now working a minimum wage delivery job just to scrape together enough cash to pay his court-appointed public defenders. He stumbled slightly as he reached the security kiosk, nearly dropping the flimsy cardboard drink carrier. As he scrambled to catch the spilling coffees, he looked up, his eyes locked directly onto mine. Bradley froze completely. The color drained from his face with such violent speed that he looked physically ill. He stared at the crisp, immaculate lines of my military uniform. He stared at the heavy, undeniable authority radiating from the elite security detail flanking me, and finally his wide, terrified eyes landed on the bright, shining star of a brigadier general pinned securely to my shoulder. He did not try to speak. He did not attempt to apologize, beg for mercy, or offer any of the pathetic, sniveling excuses he had tried to use in the interrogation room when the federal trap had finally snapped shut. He simply stood there, clutching a bag of greasy breakfast sandwiches, completely crushed by the overwhelming, undeniable reality of his own absolute insignificance. The armed guard at the checkpoint stepped forward, completely ignoring Bradley's stunned paralysis. The guard barked a sharp, uncompromising order demanding that the delivery driver step aside immediately and clear the path for the general. Bradley flinched at the harsh command. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in total, unmitigated defeat. He shuffled awkwardly backward, pressing himself against the cold metal fencing of the barricade to get out of my way. I did not slow my pace. I did not offer him a single glance of pity, anger, or acknowledgement. I walked right past him, the heavy click of my combat boots echoing firmly against the pavement. I left him standing in the shadow of the Pentagon, a broken, pathetic man, entirely consumed by the consequences of his own blinding arrogance. I stepped into the waiting armored SUV, the heavy door closing firmly behind me, completely sealing off the toxic noise of the past. The engine roared to life, and as the vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, I looked forward, my mind already focused on the incredible, limitless future I had finally secured for myself. While I was stepping into my armored transport at the Pentagon, securing my future and leaving Bradley to his miserable new reality, his mother was across town orchestrating her own spectacular downfall. Beatrice simply refused to accept defeat. In her delusional status-obsessed mind, the federal indictments against her son and son-in-law were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience caused by a bitter, jealous woman. She truly believed that wealth and social connections could fix absolutely anything, including high treason. Beatrice had hastily organized a luxurious, incredibly expensive private luncheon at her exclusive country club in the Virginia suburbs. With Desmond's corporate accounts frozen by the Department of Justice and Bradley completely bankrupt, Beatrice decided to take matters into her own hands. She wanted to rally her high society friends to fund a massive legal defense team. She invited dozens of wealthy socialites, politicians' wives, and corporate heiresses, booking the grand ballroom and ordering top-tier champagne and caviar on a tab she fully expected someone else to pay. She stood at the gold-trimmed podium at the front of the room, wearing her finest silk-tailored suit and a heavy, incredibly expensive pearl necklace. She tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the crowded room. She began her speech by playing the ultimate tragic victim. She dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and launched into a vicious, unhinged tirade against me. She told the room full of wealthy women that I was a conniving gold digger who simply could not handle my betters. She claimed I was a low-class, uneducated fraud who had somehow manipulated the federal government into attacking a visionary black billionaire just because I was jealous of his historical success. She painted Bradley as a devoted, innocent husband who had been totally blindsided by a psychotic woman desperate for attention. She begged her wealthy friends to open their checkbooks, claiming they were the only ones who could stop this terrible injustice and save her prestigious family name. The women in the audience were already exchanging very uncomfortable glances. They had all seen the morning news broadcasts. They had seen the federal agents hauling Desmond away in handcuffs. They knew the severity of the espionage charges. But Beatrice kept talking completely blind to the fact that her social circle was already backing away from her highly toxic brand. She thought her country club status made her untouchable. She was right in the middle of asking for million-dollar donations when the heavy double doors of the banquet hall suddenly swung open. It was not the country club waitstaff bringing out the next course. It was a highly coordinated team of 12 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The bright yellow letters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were printed boldly across their backs and chests. The lead agent, a tall woman with an absolute no-nonsense demeanor, marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. She did not wait for Beatrice to finish her sentence. She stepped right up to the podium, invading Beatrice's personal space, and pulled out a thick stack of federal warrants. She spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring every single socialite in the room heard exactly what she had to say. The agent informed Beatrice that the Internal Revenue Service had spent the last 48 hours aggressively tracing the massive web of offshore accounts Desmond had used to funnel his treasonous bribe money. She stated that their forensic accountants had discovered a direct, undeniable pipeline of illicit funds flowing straight from those offshore servers into Beatrice's personal bank accounts. Beatrice went completely pale. The crystal glass slipped from her trembling hand and shattered against the polished wooden floor. She tried to stammer out a defense, claiming she was a respectable woman, a pillar of the community, and that they were making a terrible, embarrassing mistake. The federal agent cut her off entirely. She announced that because Beatrice's entire luxurious lifestyle had been directly funded by the proceeds of international espionage and corporate fraud, the federal government was initiating an immediate and total asset seizure. The agent read the list of seized assets aloud for the entire country club to hear. She announced the immediate confiscation of Beatrice's 2 luxury vehicles currently parked out front in the valet lot. She announced the complete freezing of her retirement portfolios, her checking accounts, and her vast real estate holdings. Then the agent looked directly at the heavy pearl necklace Beatrice was wearing. She informed the horrified older woman that the jewelry had been purchased with stolen Pentagon funds just 3 months prior. The agent held out a plastic evidence bag and demanded she take the necklace off and hand it over as federal evidence right that second. Beatrice trembled violently. Her aristocratic facade crumbled into pure pathetic terror as she reached behind her neck. She unclasped the pearls with shaking fingers, dropping them into the plastic bag in front of her gasping, wide-eyed friends. The agent then turned to the country club manager who had rushed into the room upon hearing the commotion. The agent officially informed him that Beatrice's exorbitant club membership had also been paid for with dirty money. The manager immediately nodded, stating that her membership was revoked effective immediately. Beatrice was publicly stripped of her wealth, her prized social status, and her last shred of dignity. She was escorted out of the grand ballroom by the armed federal agents, forced to walk past the very women she had just tried to scam. The high society friends she had relied on turned their backs on her, whispering in disgust as she was marched out of the building, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the crushing reality of her own downfall. While my mother-in-law was being publicly stripped of her aristocratic facade and marched out of her beloved country club by federal agents, a very different kind of reality was setting in across town. Deep inside a secure federal holding facility, the glamorous, arrogant illusion that Courtney had wrapped herself in was rapidly disintegrating. I would later learn the exact details of this spectacular betrayal from the lead FBI investigator assigned to my case. Courtney was sitting alone in a stark concrete interrogation room. The designer trench coat she had flaunted in my living room just 24 hours earlier was now crumpled and stained with nervous sweat. The massive blinding diamond ring on her left hand, which had once felt like the ultimate trophy of her conquest, suddenly felt like a heavy, dangerous shackle. She had spent the last 2 hours pacing the small room, frantically demanding a phone call and screaming at the guards that she was a highly connected corporate lobbyist who demanded immediate release. The heavy steel door finally opened, but it was not the rescue team she was expecting. It was a court-appointed defense attorney. Desmond and Bradley had both explicitly promised her that Apex Tech kept a dedicated team of elite $1,000-an-hour fixers on retainer for situations exactly like this. But the exhausted, overworked public defender sitting across from her delivered a reality check that completely shattered her world. The attorney informed Courtney that there were no elite fixers coming to save her. He stated plainly that the federal government had just executed a hard, uncompromising freeze on every single asset connected to Apex Tech, Desmond and Bradley. Courtney sat completely frozen as the lawyer read off the list of seized accounts. Bradley's inflated executive salary was gone. His offshore investment portfolios were locked. His luxury vehicles were impounded. Even the funds used to purchase the diamond ring currently sitting on her finger were being traced by IRS criminal investigators as the proceeds of international espionage. The attorney looked her dead in the eye and explained the severity of her situation. She was an unregistered foreign lobbyist caught in the epicenter of a massive national security breach. She was looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary, and the man who had promised her a life of unimaginable wealth and power was officially irrevocably bankrupt. Courtney was a highly calculating survivor. She had built her entire career by knowing exactly when to pivot and exactly who to throw overboard to save herself. She did the math in her head. Loyalty to a broke, disgraced man facing decades of federal prison time simply did not exist in her vocabulary. She immediately shifted gears. She slammed her hand flat against the metal table and demanded that the public defender leave the room and bring back the lead federal prosecutor. She stated with absolute icy conviction that she was not going down for the arrogant mistakes of two incompetent men. 10 minutes later, two senior FBI agents and a federal prosecutor walked into the holding room. Courtney did not waste a single second attempting to defend Bradley. She looked directly at the agents and laid her cards on the table. She offered them the absolute undeniable head of the vice president of logistics on a silver platter. In exchange, she demanded a signed ironclad agreement granting her full and total immunity from prosecution. The federal agents sat down, pulled out their recording devices, and listened. Once the immunity paperwork was drafted and signed, Courtney reached across the table and handed over the passcode to her personal encrypted smartphone. She explained that Bradley had insisted on using a highly restricted hidden messaging application for all their correspondence. He had proudly bragged to her that the app utilized a proprietary encryption key that his military wife would never ever be able to trace or decrypt. He genuinely believed he was a master spy, outsmarting a high-ranking cyber warfare specialist. The FBI agents plugged the device into their forensic extraction terminal and began scrolling through months of digital correspondence. They found everything. Courtney provided them with the exact unredacted messages where Bradley had explicitly signed off on the foreign data transfers. She handed over the digital receipts, proving he knew the offshore routing numbers were highly illegal. She exposed every single arrogant, boastful text message where Bradley detailed his complicity in Desmond's treasonous operation just to impress her. But as the lead investigator scrolled deeper into the hidden chat logs, the atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted from professional satisfaction to absolute horrifying disgust. The agent stopped scrolling. His face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. He leaned forward and read a specific lengthy thread of messages aloud for the official record. The messages revealed that Bradley was not just a greedy corporate fraud who had stumbled into treason. He was a deeply malicious, calculating traitor who was actively plotting to destroy my entire life to cover his own tracks. In the texts, Bradley had explicitly laid out a step-by-step plan to download a massive cache of the stolen classified Pentagon data onto an untraceable physical flash drive. He detailed exactly how he was going to sneak into my home office, bypass my personal security measures, and physically plant that flash drive deep inside my personal off-duty laptop. His plan was horrifyingly clear. The moment the federal government inevitably discovered the data leak at Apex Tech, Bradley was going to anonymously tip off the Department of Defense. He intended to frame me his own wife for the entire espionage operation. He had proudly texted Courtney that the government would immediately assume the high-ranking Cyber Command officer was the mastermind behind the breach. He bragged that I would be thrown into a federal military prison for the rest of my life, leaving him completely clear of suspicion and free to enjoy his stolen wealth with his new mistress. The federal agent stared at the screen in stunned silence. The sheer, breathtaking malice of his plan was undeniable. Bradley had been fully prepared to send a commanding officer in the United States military to prison for treason just to save his own skin and secure his lavish lifestyle. The lead FBI agent stood up from the table, his jaw clenched tight. He gathered the extracted forensic files and looked at the prosecutor. The parameters of the case had just drastically changed. Bradley was no longer just being charged with corporate fraud and accessory to espionage. The evidence Courtney had just handed over guaranteed that he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The prosecutor immediately began drafting a highly classified addendum to the indictment. Bradley was now officially being charged with conspiracy to commit treason and the malicious premeditated conspiracy to frame a commanding military officer. The bright morning sun reflected blindingly off the white marble steps of the United States Capitol building. I stepped out of the black armored vehicle wearing my formal dress uniform, my combat boots hitting the pavement with a heavy, definitive strike. A massive swarm of reporters, photographers, and camera crews immediately surged forward against the metal security barricades. They were shouting my name, holding microphones as far out as their arms could reach, desperate for a single quote. 2 weeks ago, these exact same journalists had gleefully regurgitated the vicious smear campaign paid for by my soon-to-be ex-husband and his corrupt billionaire brother-in-law. 2 weeks ago, they had called me a bitter, hysterical, mentally unstable woman who was trying to ruin a historic tech company out of pure jealousy. Today they were completely silent as Admiral Winston and a tight perimeter of military police escorted me up the steps and into the building. The Senate Intelligence Committee chamber was packed to absolute capacity. Every single seat in the public gallery was taken. Every major news network in the country was broadcasting the hearing live on national television. I walked down the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight, and took my seat at the solitary witness table, facing the raised, semicircular dais where the senators sat. Admiral Winston took a seat directly behind me, offering a quiet, deeply respectful nod. Sitting at the very center of the raised dais was the chairman of the committee. This was the exact same powerful, corrupt senator who had confidently promised Desmond he would have my military career destroyed. He was the man who had panicked and dropped the phone when the FBI raided his offices. Now he was sweating profusely under the harsh television lights. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, his face flushed with a desperate, cornered energy. He knew his political survival depended entirely on discrediting my investigation before I could enter my findings into the official congressional record. The senator slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, bringing the chaotic room to a sharp, immediate halt. He did not waste a single second with formal pleasantries. He leaned aggressively into his microphone and launched a vicious, calculated attack directly at my character. He stared down at me with absolute contempt and stated that my entire presence in this chamber was a profound waste of taxpayer money. He loudly declared that I was not a reliable witness, but rather a deeply disgruntled spouse who had weaponized a low-level government clearance to execute a personal vendetta. He pointed his finger at me, telling the national television audience that I was currently going through a highly toxic public divorce. He claimed that my severe emotional instability made my so-called forensic audit completely invalid. The senator did not stop there. He raised his voice, his tone dripping with thick, patronizing misogyny. He asked the committee how they could possibly trust a young, emotional woman who clearly could not handle the towering financial success of her husband and his brilliant, self-made African-American brother-in-law. He accused me of deliberately trying to sabotage a historic $500 million defense contract out of pure bitter spite because I felt inadequate in the shadow of Black-owned excellence. He pounded his fist on his desk, shouting that my audit was nothing more than an illegal abuse of military power designed to destroy innocent corporate leaders. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not flush with anger, and I certainly did not lower my head in shame. I let him yell. I let him spew his desperate, fabricated garbage into the congressional record for every single citizen in the country to hear. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. I knew exactly why he was screaming. He was terrified. He was trying to build a massive smokescreen because he knew the federal net was closing around his throat. The senator slammed his gavel down one more time, demanding that I answer his accusations. He aggressively ordered me to confess to the committee that I had fabricated the offshore data routing evidence just to punish my husband. I slowly reached forward and pressed the small button at the base of my microphone. A sharp red light blinked on, signaling that my audio was broadcasting live across the nation. I kept my voice incredibly calm, icy, and completely devoid of emotion. I told the senator that I would not waste the committee's time defending the technical merits of my cyber audit. I stated that the forensic evidence of international espionage committed by Apex Tech had already been fully verified by the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Security Agency. I reached down and opened the heavy black binder resting on the table in front of me. I told the senator that I was not here to discuss my ex-husband. I was here to discuss the exact nature of the senator's deeply corrupt relationship with a man currently sitting in federal custody for high treason. The blood drained completely from the senator's face. He opened his mouth to object, reaching frantically for his gavel, but I did not give him a fraction of a second to interrupt me. I looked down at the documents provided directly by the FBI following their raid on Desmond's hidden servers and the extraction of Courtney's encrypted phone. I began to read the transcripts aloud, my voice echoing crisply through the massive silent chamber. I read the exact date and time of an encrypted text message sent from Desmond's private phone directly to the senator's secure device. I read Desmond's exact words, explicitly promising the senator a deposit of $2.5 million in exchange for guaranteeing that the Apex Tech software contract would bypass the standard Pentagon security review. The senator began to visibly shake in his high-backed leather chair. He stammered into his microphone, claiming the documents I was reading were illegally obtained and entirely fabricated. I ignored his pathetic panic completely. I turned the page of my binder and read the senator's exact word-for-word response to Desmond. I read the specific Cayman Islands offshore routing number the senator had provided to receive the illegal bribe. I read the subsequent text messages, where the senator promised to personally destroy the career of any military officer who dared to audit the Apex Tech source code. I read the exact, undeniable digital receipts proving that the man sitting at the center of the Senate Intelligence Committee had willingly sold out the national security of the United States military for a deposit into a hidden shell company. I closed the heavy black binder and looked up at the raised dais. The entire congressional chamber had gone dead silent. The reporters in the gallery were staring at the senator in absolute horrifying shock. The other politicians sitting beside him were physically leaning their chairs away from him, desperate to distance themselves from a man who had just been exposed as a traitor on live television. The dead silence in the Senate Intelligence Committee chamber stretched for exactly 2 seconds before the entire room exploded into absolute chaos. The press gallery erupted into a deafening roar of shouted questions and frantic movement. The sound of camera shutters echoed like a sustained machine gun volley as every single lens zoomed in on the raised dais. The corrupt senator realized instantly that his political career was imploding on live national television. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, terrified pallor before a deep, dangerous shade of purple rushed into his cheeks. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and began slamming it violently against his polished desk. He screamed for order, striking the wood with unhinged, desperate force, but the sharp cracks could not drown out the absolute uproar of the reporters demanding answers about the offshore bribes. Realizing his meticulously crafted reputation was disintegrating by the second, the senator launched a vicious, desperate counterattack. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at me. He shouted into his microphone that I had just committed a severe federal crime. He accused me of conducting an illegal, unconstitutional cyber intrusion against a sitting member of the United States Senate. He yelled that military officers could not spy on elected officials without a highly specific federal warrant. He aggressively claimed that my entire classified dossier was nothing more than the result of a rogue, treasonous domestic surveillance operation designed to manipulate the legislative branch. He looked past my witness table toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber. He screamed for the sergeant-at-arms and the Capitol Police to step forward immediately. He officially declared me in contempt of Congress. He ordered the armed guards to place me in handcuffs right that second. He shouted that I was going to federal prison for violating the Fourth Amendment and attempting a military coup against a civilian government official. The tension in the magnificent marble room spiked to a terrifying level. For a brief moment, the media actually stopped shouting, captivated by the unprecedented threat of a high-ranking military officer being arrested on the Senate floor. The camera operators locked their focus onto my face, waiting to see if I would finally crack under the immense pressure of federal prosecution. Two uniformed Capitol Police officers stepped out from the shadows near the main exit. They looked incredibly hesitant. They glanced up at the screaming senator, then down at my immaculate military uniform clearly torn between their sworn duty to the chamber and the completely bizarre situation of detaining a decorated cyber warfare specialist on live television. The senator screamed at them again, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic, demanding they do their jobs and physically restrain me before I could release any more classified information. I did not move a single muscle. I did not stand up to protest his baseless accusations. I did not reach for my encrypted tablet or try to defend my actions to the confused approaching guards. I simply sat in my wooden chair with my hands folded neatly on top of the black binder. I kept my eyes locked directly on the senator. I watched the heavy beads of sweat rolling down his temples. I watched the desperate cornered animal panic consuming his every movement. He truly believed he had found a legal loophole to save his own skin. He genuinely thought he could throw me in a holding cell and have the undeniable evidence of his treason thrown out of court on a procedural technicality. The two armed officers walked slowly down the center-carpeted aisle. They were just 10 feet away from my witness table when the dynamic of the entire room shifted with violent, undeniable force. Admiral Winston stood up from the chair directly behind me. The Four-Star Admiral, a man who commanded the absolute respect of the entire United States Armed Forces, did not even look at the approaching guards. He stepped smoothly forward and took his place right beside me at the witness table. He reached down with a heavy, steady hand and pulled the microphone directly toward his face. Admiral Winston's voice boomed through the massive chamber. It was not a frantic shout like the senator's desperate screaming. It was a deep, resonant command forged from decades of supreme military authority. He ordered the security detail to stand down immediately. The two Capitol Police officers froze in their tracks instantly, their hands dropping away from their utility belts. They stepped backward, without a single word of protest, deferring completely to the towering military presence standing beside me. The senator slammed his gavel one more time, screaming into his microphone that the military had absolutely no jurisdiction in his congressional chamber, and demanding that the arrest proceed. Admiral Winston looked up at the raised dais. He stared straight through the corrupt politician with eyes like chips of flint. He stated loudly and clearly for the official congressional record and the millions of people watching at home that Colonel Kendra did not execute a rogue domestic surveillance operation. He informed the highly publicized hearing that I had acted under the direct explicit authorization of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. The Admiral then delivered the final absolute crushing blow. He announced to the silent room that this entire cybersecurity operation was classified level black. He explained in a calm, lethal tone that the wiretaps and digital interceptions were perfectly legal. Desmond was not simply a civilian contractor operating a domestic tech company. The Admiral revealed that due to my forensic audit, Desmond had already been officially designated by the intelligence community as an active foreign intelligence threat. Admiral Winston informed the senator that by secretly communicating with Desmond to secure illegal bribes, the senator had willingly engaged with a monitored enemy of the state over federal communication lines. There was no illegal search or unconstitutional overreach. The senator had simply walked blindly and greedily directly into a massive federally authorized counterterrorism sting. The absolute, inescapable reality of the situation hit the corrupt politician all at once. He was not just facing standard political bribery charges or campaign finance violations. He was facing catastrophic federal espionage charges. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and clattered loudly onto his polished mahogany desk. His knees completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his high-backed leather chair, his mouth hanging open as his breath came in shallow, terrified gasps. His political career, his freedom, and his entire life were completely undeniably ruined. The absolute terrifying reality of the situation hit the corrupt senator all at once. He was no longer a powerful, untouchable Washington politician. He was a cornered traitor completely exposed on live television. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers. It clattered loudly onto his polished mahogany desk, rolling off the edge and hitting the carpeted floor below with a dull thud. His knees completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his high-backed leather chair, his mouth hanging open as his breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. His eyes darted frantically around the massive Senate chamber. He looked at the reporters in the press gallery whose cameras were flashing relentlessly, capturing every second of his spectacular downfall. He looked at his fellow committee members, who were physically leaning away from him, their faces masks of pure, unmistakable disgust. He looked at the Capitol police officers standing in the aisle, who had completely lowered their weapons, and were now waiting for direct orders from the Four-Star Admiral standing right beside me. The senator realized with crushing certainty that his political career was entirely irrevocably over. He was not just facing standard bribery charges or a slap on the wrist for campaign finance violations. He was facing catastrophic federal espionage charges. The offshore routing numbers, the encrypted text messages, the deliberate attempt to sabotage a classified military audit. It was all perfectly documented, legally obtained, and now permanently entered into the congressional record. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. The silence in the chamber was finally broken by a sharp, authoritative voice from the back of the room. It was not a reporter, and it was certainly not another politician. It was a senior agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by 4 heavily armed tactical officers. The FBI agent marched directly down the center aisle, bypassing the stunned Capitol Police. He did not ask for permission to approach the dais. He walked straight up the short flight of stairs and stopped right in front of the senator's desk. The agent reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed document. He slapped it down onto the mahogany surface right next to the senator's trembling hands. The agent announced loudly, ensuring the microphones picked up every single word, that the document was a federal arrest warrant issued directly by the Department of Justice. He stated that the senator was officially being taken into federal custody for high treason conspiracy to commit espionage and severe violations of the National Security Act. The senator did not try to argue. He did not scream or demand a lawyer. He was completely, utterly broken. He slowly raised his shaking hands, offering his wrist to the federal agents. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent chamber was the final definitive sound of his ruined legacy. As the agents hauled the disgraced politician out of his high-backed chair and marched him down the aisle, the news networks completely lost their minds. The live broadcast captured every humiliating second of his arrest. The commentators were shouting over each other, desperately trying to analyze the unprecedented explosive turn of events. Admiral Winston leaned closer to his microphone. He did not shout to be heard over the rising chaos. He spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had just successfully executed a flawless military operation. He addressed the remaining members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He informed them that the threat assessment briefing was now officially concluded. He stated that the Department of Defense had effectively neutralized the hostile foreign intelligence threat, and that all further inquiries would be handled directly by the Department of Justice. The Admiral turned to me. He offered a slight, deeply respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the grueling, high-stakes battle I had just won. He told me it was time to leave. I closed the heavy black binder on the table in front of me. I stood up, adjusting the crisp lines of my dress uniform. I did not look back at the empty chair where the corrupt senator had sat just moments before. I did not acknowledge the frantic reporters screaming my name. I walked out of the Senate chamber alongside Admiral Winston, my combat boots echoing firmly against the marble floor. The aftermath of the hearing was swift, brutal, and entirely devastating for the villains who had spent 8 years trying to destroy me. Within minutes of the live broadcast, the stock price of Apex Tech plummeted into an absolute terrifying freefall. Investors panicked, immediately dumping their shares as news of the federal espionage indictments flooded the global markets. By the end of the trading day, the company was officially valued at zero. The federal government stepped in, seizing the entire corporation, freezing every single corporate asset, and locking down the headquarters in Silicon Valley. Desmond's sprawling, supposedly untouchable billionaire empire was entirely dismantled. The financial ruin did not stop there. It trickled down rapidly, violently, destroying the lavish, arrogant lives of the family members who had built their identities on Desmond's dirty money. Monica, who had proudly mocked my off-the-rack dress and bragged about her impending luxury purchases, was physically evicted from her multi-million-dollar estate. The federal agents arrived with seizure warrants, ordering her to vacate the premises immediately. They did not allow her to pack her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, or her vast collection of luxury handbags, because every single item had been purchased with funds traced directly to the offshore espionage accounts. She was forced to leave the mansion carrying nothing but a few cheap basic necessities shoved into black plastic trash bags. She ended up dragging those bags into a grimy, run-down roadside motel, viciously screaming at her mother in the parking lot, blaming Beatrice for enabling Desmond's dangerous arrogance. Beatrice, completely stripped of her aristocratic facade, screamed right back. The two women who had bonded for years over their shared cruelty and unearned superiority were now completely consumed by their own bitter, toxic resentment. They had absolutely nothing left but each other, and they hated it. As I sat in the quiet, secure sanctuary of my own home later that evening, my phone began to ring. It was not my personal device, which I had permanently deactivated after leaving the White House. It was the secure, unlisted number I used strictly for official military business. I checked the caller ID. It was a collect call from a federal penitentiary in Virginia. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I accepted the charges, wanting to hear the final pathetic culmination of his absolute destruction. The line clicked open. Bradley's voice came through the speaker, frantic, breathless, and completely drenched in panicked tears. He was sobbing uncontrollably, his words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. He begged me to listen to him. He cried that he was sitting in a freezing holding cell, that his public defender was ignoring him, and that the federal prosecutors were threatening him with decades in a maximum security prison. He pleaded with me to transfer funds from my military accounts to pay his $2 million bail. He swore that he loved me, that he had always loved me, and that Courtney meant absolutely nothing to him. He sobbed, begging his wife to save him from the terrifying reality he had created for himself. I sat perfectly still on my sofa, listening to the broken, desperate weeping of a man who had spent 8 years trying to make me feel small. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I let him cry for exactly 5 seconds. I leaned closer to the phone. I kept my voice incredibly quiet, icy, and completely devoid of emotion. I told him not to embarrass me. I hung up the phone, placed it face down on the coffee table, and permanently blocked the number. The toxic, suffocating chapter of my past was officially undeniably over. I was finally truly free. 1 month had passed since I placed my phone face down on my coffee table and permanently blocked the number of the federal penitentiary in Virginia. The heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic marriage was completely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of clarity. I stood in the center of the main interior courtyard of the Pentagon, surrounded by the towering concrete walls of the nation's military headquarters. The morning air was sharp and cool, a perfect contrast to the stifling, desperate heat of the White House security checkpoint where this entire public ordeal had begun. Today, there were no frantic corporate lobbyists, no arrogant tech billionaires flashing gold-trimmed invitations, and no entitled relatives demanding I shrink myself to protect their fragile egos. Today was a day of absolute uncompromising military precision. I stood at the position of attention, my dress uniform perfectly pressed, my combat boots polished to a high mirror shine. A massive stage had been erected in the center of the courtyard draped in heavy bunting, featuring the colors of the United States Armed Forces. Directly across from the stage sat the National Press Corps. It was a deeply satisfying, almost poetic reversal of reality. These were the exact same journalists, network anchors, and political commentators who had gleefully broadcast the vicious smear campaign funded by the stolen offshore money of my former brother-in-law. Just 30 days ago, those cameras had painted me as a mentally unstable, jealous woman, desperately trying to ruin a visionary technology empire out of pure spite. They had demanded my immediate resignation. They had called for congressional investigations into my character. Now those same reporters sat in absolute reverent silence. Their cameras were mounted on heavy tripods broadcasting this military ceremony live across the globe. The scrolling text at the bottom of their news feeds no longer called me a rogue military wife. They called me a brilliant tactical mastermind, a silent guardian of federal security, and a definitive national hero. The media narrative had completely flipped, forced to bend to the undeniable weight of the federal indictments I had personally engineered. As the military band finished playing a traditional ceremonial march, my mind briefly flashed back to the countless corporate galas and lavish country club dinners I had been forced to attend during my marriage. My former husband had always insisted on arriving late to make a grand entrance. He would immediately abandon me at the coat check or force me to stand silently near the catering tables while he aggressively networked with wealthy executives. He had explicitly instructed me never to speak about my job at Cyber Command, constantly reminding me that a mid-level public servant would only embarrass his high-profile corporate image. He needed to be the smartest, most important person in any room we entered. Yet as I looked around the Pentagon courtyard, I saw the exact opposite of that manufactured superiority. Standing in perfectly aligned rows flanking the main stage were hundreds of elite military personnel. Battalion commanders, intelligence directors, and senior tactical analysts had all gathered to witness this moment. The highest-ranking military officials in the free world were currently standing at rigid attention, completely silent, showing absolute respect for the woman my ex-husband had deemed entirely worthless. The Secretary of Defense stepped up to the wooden podium at the center of the stage. He adjusted the microphones and looked out over the assembled crowd before turning his gaze directly toward me. His voice echoed powerfully across the courtyard, amplified by the heavy outdoor speakers. He began to read the official, highly classified commendation into the permanent military record. He detailed the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the national security threat that had loomed over the Department of Defense. He explained to the silent audience how a deeply malicious, highly sophisticated backdoor had been woven into the infrastructure of a $500 million military contract. He stated that without my unparalleled expertise, relentless dedication, and absolute refusal to bow to massive political and personal intimidation, the most sensitive troop deployment data in the United States military would have been sold directly to hostile foreign intelligence agencies. He praised my division for executing a flawless, globally coordinated counter-espionage operation that not only neutralized the immediate digital threat, but also dismantled a massive ring of high-level political corruption. He noted that while the traders sought the bright lights of public fame and illicit wealth, I had operated in the quiet shadows, putting the safety of the nation above my own personal comfort. The Secretary of Defense closed the leather-bound portfolio on the podium. He announced that extraordinary service in the defense of the nation requires extraordinary recognition. He stepped back from the microphone, making way for Admiral Winston. The Four-Star Admiral marched down the steps of the stage and walked directly toward me, his face glowing with immense, undeniable pride. He stopped right in front of me, returning my crisp salute with perfect form. The Admiral spoke loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the very back of the press gallery. He stated that by the direct authorization of the Commander-in-Chief, my current rank was no longer sufficient for the level of strategic command I had demonstrated. Admiral Winston reached up to the lapels of my uniform jacket. With slow, highly ceremonial precision, he removed the silver oak leaves that designated my rank as a lieutenant colonel. He handed the old insignia to a waiting military aide. Then he reached into a small velvet box and retrieved two heavy, polished silver 5-point stars. He pinned the stars securely to my shoulders. The flashbulbs of the press corps erupted in a blinding, continuous wave of light as the Admiral took a step back and saluted me once again. He officially addressed me by my new title. I was no longer a lieutenant colonel. I had just received a highly rare, immediate battlefield promotion. I was now a brigadier general, cementing my place as the youngest officer to ever achieve that rank in the entire history of United States Cyber Command. We were standing at the heavily guarded security checkpoint of the White House when my husband dug his fingers into my arm. He pulled me close, his breath hot against my ear, as he whispered to not embarrass him today. He told me I was just a mid-level government clerk, a financial drain, and that I needed to stand in the shadows while his wealthy brother-in-law did the talking. I did not argue. I simply reached into my purse, handed the Secret Service agent my personal security credential, and watched the color drain completely from the agent's face before a four-star admiral rushed over to salute me. My name is Kendra, and I am 34 years old. To understand how my husband's arrogance led to his absolute destruction on national television, you have to see exactly what happened in the moments before that security scanner flashed green. The evening air in Washington was crisp, and the line for the presidential reception buzzed with senators, defense contractors, and high society elites. Bradley, my husband of 8 years, was sweating through his custom Italian suit. He kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, desperate to look like he belonged among the power players of the nation. Standing right in front of us was the reason Bradley felt so important. Desmond, his sister's husband. Desmond was a brilliant, self-made African-American tech billionaire who had built his company Apex Tech into a dominating force in Silicon Valley. Bradley rode his brother-in-law's coattails, relentlessly holding a hollow vice president title at Apex Tech that paid him an exorbitant salary for doing virtually nothing. Desmond was currently speaking loudly enough for the surrounding politicians to hear, bragging about the $500 million cybersecurity contract his company was slated to sign with the Pentagon the very next morning. His voice boomed over the polite chatter of the crowd, making bold promises about revolutionizing military data storage and securing national assets. His wife Monica stood beside him, dripping in diamonds and adjusting her designer fur wrap. Monica turned her gaze toward me, her eyes sweeping up and down my simple navy blue evening gown with undisguised contempt. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped closer to me. She asked if I had bought my dress at a discount outlet. She said my outfit was completely inappropriate for a red carpet event, and suggested that once we got inside the reception, I should probably go stand in the corner near the coat check so people would not associate me with their VIP table. She patted my shoulder condescendingly, adding that it was sweet of Bradley to let me tag along considering my salary could barely cover the cost of the parking valet. I kept my face perfectly neutral, offering her a polite, tight smile. For 8 years, I had endured this exact brand of humiliation from my husband's family. They viewed me as a financial burden, a pathetic public servant, leeching off taxpayer money. Bradley had convinced them and himself that my job at the Department of Defense was nothing more than basic technical support. He loved to tell his wealthy friends that I reset passwords and fixed frozen computer screens for government bureaucrats. Whenever I tried to explain the actual scope of my work, Bradley would interrupt me, changing the subject to boast about his latest luxury car purchase or Desmond's soaring stock prices. He needed me to be insignificant so he could feel powerful. Bradley yanked my arm again, his grip bruising my skin through the fabric of my sleeve. He told me to stop staring at Monica and show some respect. He hissed that Desmond was about to secure the most lucrative defense contract in the history of Apex Tech, and my awkward low-income presence was already a liability. He warned me to keep my mouth shut when we reached the metal detectors, reminding me that my cheap government ID would probably just confuse the security detail. I looked at the man I had married. His face was twisted with anxiety and fragile ego. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. I had spent months quietly reviewing Apex Tech's network architecture for my department, and the things I had found disgusted me even more than my husband's dismissive behavior. But I could not reveal my hand just yet. I had to wait for the perfect moment to let them destroy themselves. We finally reached the front of the security line. A stern Secret Service agent stood behind a bulletproof podium flanked by heavily armed military personnel. Desmond stepped up with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He flashed a brilliant smile, slapped his gold-trimmed VIP invitation onto the scanner, and loudly announced that he was the CEO of Apex Tech, here as a special guest of the Armed Services Committee. The scanner beeped. It was not a pleasant chime. It was a harsh, blaring red error tone. The Secret Service agent frowned, typing rapidly on his keyboard. He looked up at Desmond, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. He stated that the contractor clearance associated with the Apex Tech invitation had been flagged and suspended. Access was firmly denied. Desmond's confident smile vanished instantly. He slammed his fist on the podium, shouting that the machine was broken. He demanded that the agent call the chief of staff, immediately threatening to have the man fired for disrespecting a major federal contractor. Monica gasped dramatically, clutching Desmond's arm, while Bradley went completely pale. Bradley spun around and glared at me with absolute fury. He pointed his finger directly at my chest. He yelled that this was my fault. He claimed that because I had linked my basic federal employee number to their guest registration, my low-level clearance had triggered a security lockdown. He ordered me to get out of the line, demanding that I step away so I would not ruin the biggest night of his life. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against his baseless accusation. Instead, I stepped directly past my panicking husband and stood in front of the bewildered Secret Service agent. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a solid white, highly encrypted military identification card. It bore a specialized gold insignia that ordinary civilians never see. I placed it flat against the optical scanner. The machine chimed with a pleasant musical tone. The screen surrounding the podium instantly turned bright green, displaying a highly restricted clearance authorization. The Secret Service agent stared at the monitor. All the color drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the classified profile flashing across his screen. He swallowed hard, his hands actually trembling as he looked past me toward the heavily guarded rotunda. Standing near the inner doors was a formidable older man in a crisp naval uniform adorned with rows of service ribbons. It was Admiral Winston, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The young agent leaned around the bulletproof glass, his voice cracking slightly as he called out to the high-ranking officer. He stammered, telling the Admiral that she was here. Bradley scoffed loudly, attempting to grab my shoulder to pull me away from the podium. He hissed my name, telling me to stop playing games with the guards before we all got arrested. But Bradley never got the chance to touch me. Admiral Winston turned around, locked eyes with me, and marched straight past the velvet ropes. He completely ignored Desmond's furious shouting and Bradley's pathetic attempts to apologize for my behavior. The Four-Star Admiral stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He snapped his boots together, stood perfectly straight, and raised his hand in a sharp, flawless military salute. His booming voice echoed across the suddenly silent security checkpoint. He welcomed me back, calling me Colonel. He announced loud and clear that the President of the United States was waiting for my threat assessment briefing in the Oval Office. The most profound lesson from this story is that true value is never determined by the assessments of others. When toxic family members project their deep insecurities onto us, it is easy to internalize that cruelty as failure. However, true strength lies in recognizing that conditional love reflects their limitations, not our worth. By establishing firm boundaries and silently building our own independence, we strip away their power. Ultimate success becomes our loudest, most undeniable response, proving that genuine healing always begins from within. If you have ever reclaimed your peace, please share your story and comment below.